Asato ma sadgamaya tamaso maham jyotir gamaya mrityurmam amritam gamaya aviravir maedhi rudra yate dakshinam mukham te namaham pahinityam. Om, lead us from the unreal to the real. Lead us from darkness unto light. Lead us from death to immortality. Reach us through and through ourselves, and evermore protect us from ignorance by thy sweet, compassionate face. So my subject this morning is understanding self-sacrifice. The framework for our discussion is karma yoga. The goal of karma yoga is to attain spiritual freedom. In order to free ourselves from the bonds of karma, we have to learn to work with detachment. And detachment, non-attachment, is complete self-abnegation. In the beginning, the creator of this world, Prajapati, he appeared, but he had no materials with which to create. And so he just sacrificed his own body. And out of his head, he created the Brahman caste of scholars and priests. And out of his heart, he created the Kshatriya caste of warriors and rulers. And from his arms, he created the Vaishya class of merchants and landowners. And from his legs and feet, the Shudra working class. So the whole of mankind arose through self-sacrifice of the Creator. Now let's look a little bit. Well, self-sacrifice we know something about. We know something about sacrifice in the Old Testament. There's we read a lot of talk there about animal sacrifice, offering animals to God for the expiation of sin or just to glorify God. You all remember that famous story? That's maybe the favorite story of the French existentialists. And that is about Abraham and his son, Isaac. Abraham was a great devotee of God. And one day God appeared before him. And that is, he heard the voice of God commanding him, Abraham, take your son up on the mountain and sacrifice him to me. That voice he heard in the night. And commentators tell us that, what must have been the confusion in his mind for the rest of the night. How could he understand this terrible thing that he'd been commanded to do? He must have tossed and turned and couldn't sleep, and he was restless and grieving. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. It just says, in the next morning, he took his son and 2 servants. They loaded up the wood and sticks on a burro, and there they journeyed for half a day. He said, well, leave the servants here in the burro. Son, you take up these sticks of the fuel. So Isaac is carrying these sticks. They're climbing up the mountain. The boy asks father, he says, but aren't we forgetting one thing about that? Where is the sacrificial lamb? Yeah, the father said, well, don't worry about that. Just come along with me. So they get up to the top of the mountain. They fashioned there an altar. And then the father tells him, son, climb up here on this altar. And he ties him down. And then out of his cloak, he takes a dagger. He raises that up. And he's about to strike when he hears the voice of an angel saying, Abraham, stay your hand. Look over and see there in the bramble bush, there's a ram that is like a wild goat. He's tangled up in that bush. Just set Isaac free and sacrifice that goat instead. God is with you. God is very well pleased. And so that was Abraham. He was beloved of God. Later he was blessed by God and became the father of nations. Now in the New Testament, all of this talk about sacrifice, animal sacrifice, ends with the advent of the coming of Jesus. And we know the story, and Jesus and his ministry, and how in the end he allowed himself to be crucified and died for the sins of mankind. Thus he atoned for all those sins, and sacrifice was no longer necessary in that ancient sense. And it says there in the Bible, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that mankind, so that we would not perish and would have eternal life. When we think about the sacrifice, that's self-sacrifice of Jesus. I can't help but think of an old children's storybook about a giving tree. And a little boy who would go there into that tree, and leaves would fall down. And he would gather leaves, and of those leaves he would make a crown on his head, and he'd dance around the tree. He'd play king of the forest. And then he'd go, and maybe he'd swing on the branches. When he was hungry, he'd pick one of the apples. And then when he was tired, he would lay down to rest in the cool shade. Well, time passed, and the boy grew up. And the happy days there in the company of the tree passed, and he went away. Years later, he returned, and the tree was so happy to see him. Oh yeah, welcome. Here, do you want to swing again from the branches? No, he said, I don't have time to play anymore. He said, I want money. And the tree said, well, I can't give you any money, but I have apples. Why don't you pick the apples off the tree, take them to the market and sell them, and you can get money? So the boy picked all the apples, took them into the market, and time passed, and he grew. And later on, when he returned again to the tree said, well, what can I give? What do you want? What can I give you now? He said, well, now, he said, all that I want a house. The tree said, well, I can't give you a house, but I could give you the branches. I have branches here. Why don't you take the branches of the tree and maybe you put them together and build yourself a house? So the boy cut off all the branches and went and fashioned for himself a house. And there he lived. Time passed, and he grew older. And then he returned again to the tree. The tree had greeted him, expecting that they'd play as they did before. And the boy said, what can I give you? He said, well, I don't know. He said, I want a boat. And the tree said, well, I can't give you a boat. He said, but on the other hand, we still have the trunk. Why don't you take the trunk of this tree and just maybe you can make a boat out of it. And so the guy who's a man now, he cut down that tree, took the trunk, made a boat. He wasn't seen for a long time. Time passed, and then he returned to the end in the tree. The tree said, what can I do? What can I give to you? The man said, I don't really want anything. All I want now is just to rest. The tree says, well, yeah, I can help you here. What better place to rest than an old stump? So the boy sits down there. That is the old man. He sits down there on the stump. And that's the last picture there in the storybook. Contemplating his life. So it's about the giving tree. It's about non-attachment. It's about complete self-sacrifice. Well, many interpretations. Maybe it's about motherly love. Maybe it's about divine love. You know, Jesus in the Bible was approached there by a Jewish scholar who asked him in the temple, what shall we do to have eternal life? And Jesus said, well, what do the books of the law say? That is in the Old Testament. What does it say? And then the scholar quotes the verses there. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy mind, with all your strengths. And thou shalt love your neighbor as yourself. And then the scholar asked him, but who is my neighbor? And then Jesus told that famous parable about the good Samaritan. Now, a man once was on his way, traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was waylaid by robbers and thieves. And they gave him a beating. They stripped him his clothes, stole his possessions, and they just left him there by the side of the road, nearly dead. And a priest came by that way, and he saw the man by the side of the road, and he crossed over to the other side and went on his way. Time passed. A Levite came by that way. He saw that man by the side of the road. He crossed to the other side and went on his way. And then a Samaritan came that same road. He saw that man, went over to him, bound up his wounds, comforted him, lifted him up on his donkey, the burro, and carried him along there to an inn. And there they stopped there at the inn. He led him asked the innkeeper, please take care of this man. I'll pay you whatever is necessary. When I return from my journeys, I'll stop by here and pay you whatever is necessary. So we all know that story about the Good Samaritan. Well, there's different interpretations. The Samaritan, we could interpret his empathy. That is, we could say that he had fellow feeling, that he was motivated by empathy, by sympathy, to help another. And it's a common, universal human motivation. That is empathy and sympathy and pity and fellow feeling. There's another interpretation as to why, what is the motivation for the helping of the other and for the self-sacrifice, and that is an intuition of a divine, of a higher power, of a divine being, of a divine universal one only without a second, and thus motivated not by empathy, but by love and compassion. So those are different motivations. Now we're trying to understand. We're talking about self-sacrifice. What Swami Vivekananda called self-abnegation. That is removing your separate self from the equation. Non-attachment, this is the title of one of the chapters here in Karma Yoga, so these are the words of the aphorism. Non-attachment is complete self-abnegation. So we're trying to understand, what does that self-sacrifice mean? What is the self-abnegation? So we're giving you some examples of what we would think of when we think of self-sacrifice. And the giving tree, what is our motivation for giving, for helping, for being empathetic, for loving, for compassion? These are all different motivations. And in Karma Yoga, there's no work without motive. Our goal is to get to a higher and higher motive, that is to begin where we stand, and to graduate, take baby steps forward, getting to higher and higher motivations for our action. So we can see that in an example there of the Good Samaritan. There's an act, and then there's a lot of different motivations for the intention of the action. A lot of different interpretations of that action. Now in the Mahabharata, takes this whole discussion to a new level. And you remember how in the Bhagavad Gita, there's the Kurukshetra war. And the Pandava brothers, at the end, they triumph. They are celebrating their victory in this war with a great sacrifice. The sacrifice means is that to God they've offered many expensive items and fruits and flowers and food of all kinds to the gods, and then they're distributing it to all the people of the community and in the kingdom. And so it was a wonderful people had never seen such lavish gifts and the benefits of all the people in the kingdom. And they were in the midst of celebrating that great sacrifice, went into the palace, that is, into the meeting hall. There came a mongoose. And the mongoose, half of his body was golden, and half of his body was just brown. And the mongoose began to roll on the floor, right in the midst of that Durbar hall. And he was saying something while he was talking. So he's saying, well, this is no sacrifice. This is no sacrifice. And all of the guests there, they were stunned and amazed to hear what the mongoose was saying. And the ministers asked him, what do you mean? How can you what do you mean that this is no sacrifice? Let me tell you my story. The mongoose then told his story about how he was living in a in a foreign land. And there he is wandering at a time of famine. There was no food, there was no water, drought. And he came up to the middle of the night, came up there to the house of a poor Brahman. He looked in through the window, and there he saw the Brahman family. Brahmins are the poorest of those castes, because all they do is they conduct religious ceremonies. So they don't have a lot of money. But during that famine, he's looking through the window, that mongoose. He sees the Brahman had gotten that day a small, tiny little bag of barley flour. That's the only food they had to eat. And the wife had cooked it up, and they served it to his wife and his son and his wife. So there's four there seated at the table. They divide up this little barley grains between them. And then they hear a knock on the door. And no sooner they said their prayers, they hear this knock on the door. They go to the door, and there is a guest. Now, in ancient India, the idea is that part of your dharma of the householder is that a guest is like God. When a guest appears at your door, you serve him as if God himself had appeared. And so they did. They welcomed him in. Yes, sir. What can we do for you? Well, he said, I'm so hungry. Can you please give me something to eat? The father immediately said, yes, please sit down here, and offered him his portion of the food. And the guest, he just ate that up. He said, oh, you've killed me now. I'm more hungry than I was before. I'm still hungry. And the wife immediately said, oh, well, here, take my portion. So he ate that up. He's still hungry. And the son then said, well, here, sir, please take my portion. And his wife said after, please take my portion. The guest ate all that up. And he said, oh, yes, now I'm very happy. I'm well satisfied. And he left. And that night, all four of that family, they died of starvation. And the mongoose, looking through the window, he saw all this. And he climbed in through the window later, and he rolled himself on the ground, under the table, under the few crumbs that had fallen, few grains of barley that had fallen from the table. And where it touched his body, it turned the body golden. And so like this, he's telling the story in the Durbar Hall with all of the kings of the Mahabharata. He says he saw all this. Since that time, I've been searching the world to find another sacrifice that was equal to this. He said, I've never, ever found such a sacrifice. So that's the story. That's related by Swami Vedarupananda in Karma Yoga. He adds a footnote to that story himself. He says, no Westerner can understand this story. So let's try to understand it. We may think, well, in fact, all of those stories, don't they seem to be a little bit like extreme? Don't they seem to be kind of far out? So yeah, we're going to try to understand what it means. First thing we can see that these teachings, the morals, this moral that is complete self-abnegation, is the ideal of karma yoga. obviously, this is something which is beyond morality. This is something which is beyond good and evil. That is, they're not just the different characters in these parables are not just ordinary folk. They're exhibiting an extreme spiritual virtue. It's called aparigraha, that is non-attachment and complete self-abnegation. That's a spiritual virtue. So first thing is when we're talking about stories like this, we're talking about something which is beyond good and evil, that is beyond conventional morality. Well, you understand convention. We have the 7 deadly sins. Then we have the convention. Every one of those sins has got a conventional moral character, which is the antidote of that sin. That's what it means to be a good person. These stories are about going beyond being a good person to being a godly person, to being a good man, to being a God man. That's what yoga is about. Yoga is not about becoming a better person. This morning we're in the framework of karma yoga, but it's true of all the yoga practices. So it's a very advanced course. We're talking here about not being good, but about being spiritual. Not about being moral, but about, going beyond morality and moral character to spiritual character. And Jesus says, you think that this ideal is too extreme. But remember, Jesus in the Bible says, "Be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." This is the ideal. "Be ye therefore perfect." You say, well, nobody's perfect. Well, okay, here's the ideal. The ideal is to be perfect. To be morally and spiritually perfect. And then Jesus said, we know, as you remember those things, those teachings of Jesus maybe that sometimes we forget, where he says, well, you love your enemies. Yeah, okay, well, put that aside. That if a man smites you on one cheek, you turn the other cheek. Well, if a person was to insult you once, you don't forgive him 7 times, as it says in the Old Testament. No, Jesus says, no, I would say forgive him 70 times 7. So these teachings, these are teachings about spiritual character. Now, what do we mean here by spiritual? We could call them spiritual virtues. The whole list of virtues. What are these virtues? Well, you know them very well if you're a student. For example, of any of the practices of yoga. Say about Patanjali's yoga aphorisms. Begins with yama and niyama. These are just lists of spiritual virtues. That is, lists of qualities, of characteristics, character traits, which are beyond morality. Things like non-violence, truthfulness in thought, word, and deed, perfect purity, non-attachment. See, these are not conventional virtues. These are spiritual virtues that are prerequisites for the practice of yoga. Perfect inner control of the mind and contentment. Worship of God. The practice of austerities. This goes beyond the moral, to informing ourselves with spiritual character and spiritual virtues. Now, let's look at a little bit about the philosophy. There's a philosophy behind this. The philosophy behind this is just the Vedanta philosophy. That is, that there is one non-dual reality. There is one only without a second. It's called Brahman. That's the ultimate reality. We call it the truth, the good. Another name for this reality is the Atman, the self, your true self. And the whole purpose of spiritual life is to realize that you are one, that the Atman is one with Brahman, that in your true nature, that you are one with this absolute reality. This is the goal and purpose of all of the practices of yoga. Now, between ourselves and that reality, there's something there's something that stands between us. It's like a dark cloud that we look up, we can't see the sun. That's a dark cloud. That cloud is avidya. That means spiritual ignorance, which is the source of the ego. Now, the ego, by the ego, we just mean our own self, that is all of our attachments, all of our likes and dislikes. Our ego is that is, we have as it were true selves. We have a lower self, lower bird, and we have a higher bird. And the whole purpose of spiritual life now is to struggle to upgrade the program from the lower to the higher. And all of our lower self is characterized by the ego mind. That's the ahamkara. That's our false sense of false beliefs about who we are and about what our values are. That is the sum total of our attachments. What are our attachments? Our attachments are what in Christian theology, Christian language, an attachment is something which is an idol. An idol, that's the second of the Ten Commandments. Thou shalt not worship any graven image. That means an idol. An idol means a false god. And we have the attachments are the false gods in our life. That is what we would say. We would say, well, money, property, material things, people, places, things, our own belief system, our own ideology, our own ego, in a word. Those are the things which are our ultimate concerns. Those are the idols around which our life revolves. That is, we think the whole world revolves around myself and all the things that I hold dear and I value. Above all is my own ego, that is, I've made of myself an idol. And the whole idea of spiritual life, of course, is that we need a Copernican revolution in our life. And we have to realize that that we have to reconceptualize our lives to realize that that our self and all of our attachments is not the gravitational center of our life, but that there is a higher power. There is a higher reality. There is a higher self. We could call it God. We call it our own divine self, the Atman, Brahman. That is the center the idea of the yoga. Now, all of the yogas are making that the center. And the process of spiritual practice is going to be to rethink all of our behaviors and our thoughts and feelings so that they are in alignment now with a new center, a higher center. And so it's a reformation of ourself. It's a reformation of our own sense of self. Now we're talking here about self-sacrifice. And we're talking here about of our lower self. By sacrifice here we means giving up the lower for the higher. So we're giving up the lower for the higher. But the Sri Ramakrishna says in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna that, well, as we struggle to do this in spiritual life, we find that's very difficult to get rid of the ego. And Sri Ramakrishna says, yeah, you can't get rid of the ego. That's just part of that's baked into the whole psychophysiology of our humanness. Therefore, Sri Ramakrishna says there, it's like a bay tree. If you see a bay tree, you cut it down to the roots. Next day you come back and you see little sprouts there. It's come back again. Similarly, it is the ego. However much it is diminished, it returns again. Therefore, let the rascal remain as the ego of the jnani or as the ego of the devotee. Now we're talking about karma yoga. We're talking about the ego. Well, let's look here at the ego of the devotee. That is the servant ego. This is what karma yoga, that is spiritualizing everyday life. We're talking about, think back of those parables, each one kind of an example of actions done in interpreting those actions. So we're talking here about doing work as worship. The devotee, in the presence of, now we reconceptualize what is our highest ideal. That is, it is Brahman. That is, it is the Atman. That is, it is God. In the presence of God, naturally we feel a feeling of worship. That's a natural feeling. To worship is to serve. And therefore, if we are to reconfigure our lives in service of this higher ideal, that is our spiritual ideal, then through karma yoga, we can do that through doing work as worship. Just as in a shrine, or just as in ancient times, they would offer the sacrifice in an altar, and they'd offer things dear to them, to the gods in heaven. Similarly, a devotee can do his work in the workaday world, offer the fruits of the action to the God within, or to the God in everything, and thus consecrate that action so that that action becomes a selfless act, and therefore it breaks one of the links of the chain of karma. This is all about our bondage. Our bondage is links and links, millions of links of the vicious circle of karma, our own self-conscious volitional actions. In order to break the link, we have to remove our personal self-interest from the equation of the action. How do you do that? Well, there's different methods. So this morning we're talking about karma yoga. We're talking about doing work as worship. The ideal karma yogi, Swami Vedarupananda tells us, out of the source book for our for our Karma Yoga is a book. It's called Karma Yoga, Swami Vivekananda. The greatest of the Karma Yogis, of course, was Lord Buddha. And we think about the life of Buddha as interesting. Well, he never spoke about God. He never spoke really about any metaphysics or epistemology or metaethics or anything like that. But yet his whole entire life demonstrated was a life of self-abnegation and love and compassion. Because he had realized the truth of Vedanta. That is, that there is a higher truth, there is a higher reality, which is identical with our own higher self, with our own self. And therefore Buddha, as he acted, he just acted out of being who he really was. And thus we can read those wonderful stories in the Jataka tales, stories of love and compassion of the previous lives of the Buddha. So that was our subject this morning, talking here about trying to walk around this subject and understand the framework of karma, our ideal as freedom. To achieve freedom, we need to work with a non-attachment. Non-attachment is about breaking the links of the chain of karma. It's about self-sacrifice and abnegation, and ultimately the complete abnegation of our own ego. That is the merging of our own self, in Vedanta we would say, of our lower self and our higher self. The realization of our own true self, our true nature. That is the Atman, which is the goal of our spiritual life.